Hey everyone, it's LS, and today's video is going to be talking about a champion I'm getting a lot of questions about lately, as well as it's starting to even pop up in several of the Clips channels, and that is Support Nasus. Some people might wonder, why Support Nasus? Well, originally we actually played it, me, Nemesis, and some other Korean players against various LCK Academy teams last summer, mostly as an answer to Kalista, but the ADC actually really liked it and wanted to just pair it with other ADCs, but obviously, once those scrims stopped, so did any sort of talk about Nasus. Well, this past year, obviously, certain champions inside of the meta, like Zeri, has ended up popping up. Aurelia, Tryndamere, Hecarim, a lot of champions that have a really big dependence on movement speed, and even some champions that are popping up that really like stacking armor, while also there being a lot of physical damage champions in the meta right now, especially ones that build lethality, like Xayah and whatnot. So I thought, okay, maybe this is actually pretty good timing to just make another video about Nasus. So Season 12 came around, and one of the things that he really likes to build right now is obviously the current version of Frozen Heart, and it's extremely well placed, extremely cheap. It's basically his mythic before he ends up picking up a mythic at some point inside of the game, and this just makes everything for him a lot better. Whereas previously, he was building a more expensive item in the past, and it just didn't feel as good. Two of the main reasons for picking Nasus support is one, his W, and then two, his E. And these abilities are absolutely violating the game. You read their numbers, you read their scaling, and you just realize something is not quite right about what these abilities are doing. And typically, sometimes when you're looking through the LoL wiki fandom like I am on champions while I'm laying in bed at night pondering what am I doing with my life, I end up realizing that, hey, these abilities actually just don't seem right. Tie this in together with his R, which actually looks like an ability that came out in Season 12 when you read what this thing does, and you get an idea that, hey, maybe Support Nasus isn't all that bad, given that he doesn't actually need a lot of levels to get a lot of value out of these two abilities, because he's not putting any points into Q, which means that he's able to max W and E really early on. Level 11, more than good enough for support champion. And when you consider that his legendary item of Frozen Heart, or just going into Fimbul Winter, is basically his mythic, all of a sudden you get a really good champion that pairs with a lot of champions in the meta, as well as cripples a lot of champions in the meta. Okay, so let's talk about some of the gameplay stuff when you are going to be playing Nasus support. The ability that we do not take, here it is, Siphoning Strike. So the reason that you don't take this is, yes, it's an auto reset, but the base scaling per level is completely negligible. It gets 20 points per level. You're only ever going to argue about putting 1 point in it, so you're ultimately arguing about his base level AD plus the bonus physical damage that comes from the ability itself, which is 30, because you're not actually getting Siphoning Strike stacks in the game, and because it's going to be at rank 1, it means that the cooldown on it is going to be relatively high. You're probably only getting one cast out of it anyway. So because of this, and because of how not likely it is that you are going to be using Q, it's a lot more practical that you put points into your W and your E only, because these are abilities that not only can they be cast multiple times before you would even be in range to use Q once, or ever have even the chance to use Q once, but the damage that you're actually getting, or the EHP that you're getting through Wither, because obviously the cripple equates to potential health gain for both you and your allies inside of a fight, is infinitely more valuable than the Siphoning Strike damage. So Wither is basically the bread and butter of why this thing can actually work outside of laning phase. The maximum slow of 47 to 95% is absolutely broken. Maximum cripple goes from 23.5 to 47.5 on their attack speed. This ends up lasting for 5 seconds, but once you have Frozen Heart, you have Ionian Boots, you're starting to build into your second item, the uptime on this is almost permanent. Not quite, but they'll have about 1.5 seconds of downtime before immediately getting withered again. Last ability is Spirit Fire. This one is the ability that typically you will end up maxing inside a laning phase. You don't get much benefit on the cooldown, but you do get a lot of damage steroid. The flat damage scaling per rank is 40, which is absolutely insane, and the magic damage per tick goes up by 8, which they are going to be getting hit by at least 1 or 2 ticks generally per cast, unless they're withered, in which case it can actually end up being more, which just means that this is a lot of damage on a basic ability for a champion that is extremely old. The armor reduction goes up by 5% of the target's max armor, from 25 to 45%, which is super broken when you consider that generally you're wanting to pair Nasus with laners that build lethality or just hit really, really, really hard, which is why I've mentioned Xayah, Varus, Draven, champions like this in the past. However, Champion like Jhin has a lot of really cool combos with Nasus and his Wither and his E that sets up for really easy execute ranges very early on. Nasus' E is also super broken in terms of its target range. You're able to cast it from virtual safety inside of laning phase almost non-stop. You do want to be casting it only when your Comet and when your Mana Flow are up early on. It's very akin to playing Malphite in top lane or mid lane or something and, just spamming your Q rank 1, and it doesn't actually get the most value. You want to make sure that you have the Comet and the Mana Flow so that you aren't just chewing through your mana. Another thing about, obviously, is E is it can set up for really fast wave clear and recalls for you and your AD carry, and then this thing just scales massively into the mid and late game because of the armor reduction. One of the things that I have talked about with various players is that the Wither's target range is 700, which means that even the longest range ADCs, if they're in range to hit you, you're in range to cast Wither on them. And that means that this is basically a guaranteed thing that you should be able to get off in almost all situations. Because of its uptime, it's absolutely broken. We move on to the final ability, and this is an ability that reads actually like a Season 12 champion. Look at the stats on this thing. I already mentioned it. 300 bonus health at rank 1, 40 magic and armor. And then magic damage per tick is going to be 3% of the target's max HP per second. This genuinely reads like a Season 12 ability, and it is so underappreciated inside of fights. You're basically able to face check things without having to worry too much because you can always just pop your R, and you also have exhaust there as well. So his passive Soul Eater, 10, 16, 22% based on level lifesteal. This doesn't actually seem like much, but it is actually something that is somewhat important to his gameplay. Generally, when you're in laning phase, you do want to be autoing minions, even though you have no intention to last hit them or anything. And the reason that you want to do that is because it gives you a little bit of extra HP. Obviously, this only works when you're able to freely hit minions without taking damage from the enemy AD carry or the enemy support. So obviously, just keep note of that. But do not just sit around doing absolutely nothing while just perma-waiting to spam your E. Anytime that you can weave in autos on minions, you absolutely should, because it is giving you a little bit of extra HP. Generally, inside of laning phase, you do just want to be spamming the E on them. If you are hard winning your laning phase and they're not really letting you spam your E on them anymore, then that's the point to just shift into fully maxing on the W. There are going to be lanes where if you do fall behind early and you don't have any trade potential because you and your ADC partner, the jungler, someone messed up, then just start maxing W immediately so that you have the most effectiveness for mid game. W max outright inside of lane over E can also just be done in lanes where you and your ADC have a really easy approach, and the enemy ADC is a champion that is totally dependent on movement and attack speed, such as versus Kalista or Vayne. Another situation where W maxing and halting the E can also be effective is versus marksmen that end up getting early vampiric scepters, because eventually they could just reach a point where they do start sustaining through your spirit fire. If you are going to be playing Nasus, do make sure that your teammates are, or already do have, currently locked in multiple physical damage champions so that you're able to make use of his Spirit Fire total value inside of team fights, or make sure that the opponents have lots of champions that are able to actually be affected by the cripple and the slow on Wither. Difficult matchups for Nasus. I do think that certain ADCs can be rough for him, notably would be Ezreal and Xayah. Ezreal is playable against, but Xayah in the hands of a good player should be pretty difficult for Nasus to actually do anything to, at least in laning. Obviously, Nasus is weak to long-range poke and harass. He's also really weak to an abundance of enchanters, because then he's just not going to be able to add any value to the team. Other things are going to basically be non-traditional things. You're not going to be able to do anything against mages or enchanters in the marksman role, and then likewise, if they have enchanters or mages on the support, it is going to be a bit of a knife fight that is left up to mostly the marksman matchup. Enchanter supports that are able to actually heal through Nasus's poke is a bit of a problem. So mostly I'm referring to Nami and I'm referring to Soraka. Yuumi isn't as bad because you're able to tie down the target that Yuumi's attached to, and it sort of ends up being a 2-for-1. This doesn't outright mean that you can't play Nasus against these champions, because his mid-game scaling is still absolutely bonkers, and his ability to help out his teammates as well as cripple multiple opponents is still super underappreciated. For runes, it's a pretty generic setup. Comet, Mana Flow Band, Transcendence, and then Scorch or Gathering Storm inside of laning phase. For secondary runes, I always recommend Magical Boots and Futures Market. Nasus's items are very, very cheap, and Futures on a support just allows them to cheat into the item at really, really earlier times than they should ever be able to afford. These item spikes for Nasus are really underappreciated. If you really do manage your mana correctly inside of laning phase, you will never need cookies because of the way that he bullies and then sets up for his recalls. And he's already getting a lot of mana anyway, whether it be the Fimbulwinter build or just going into the Frozen Heart. You're not going to actually have mana issues on Nasus. For the summoners, I almost exclusively only recommend taking Exhaust as his second summoner, reason being that if they see the Nasus, they might try to do something like go Cleanse, that way they can cleanse the Wither, and then depending on certain all-ins, they're able to just play around it. Exhaust gives you the ability to play around this attempt to play around you, and it just gives you a lot more options inside of teamfights in the later stages of the game. The alternative to the Inspiration Tree would be going into the Resolve Tree, which is something that I think only really happens if you are going with something like Senna as your marksman and that you're going to be building Nasus in a traditional manner, in which case he's able to make use of Revitalize and then whatever other rune you want to use inside of this tree. Some people have asked about the Moonstone variation tech. I don't think it's actually that good. I think that powering Frozen Heart or just going with Fimbulwinter or just going traditional Solari is basically the best and I think only way to actually play him reliably. To cap this thing off, I am making this video in reference mostly only to pro play. I firmly believe that Nasus is an awful solo queue pick. I think this is actually very akin to champions that are very strong and competitive historically, but are absolutely terrible inside of solo queue. And what I'm referencing here is champions like Aphelios, champions like Akali, champions like Lilia, champions like Ryze. I think one of maybe the best things that I could reference this to was Once Upon a Time support Tahm Kench, where he had a really poor record inside of support on solo queue, even though he was a meta mainstay inside of competitive. The reason that I think this, even though Nasus is a really simple champion, is because teammates need to know the timings to play in on Wither and on Spiritfire. Your teammates need to know to save their abilities when the opponent is going to be afflicted by Spiritfire during the laning phase to maximize their damage output. Likewise, your teammates need to understand that they have a lot more HP in a trade than they think that they should because the opponent's attack speed is going to be so crippled. Other things that are obviously going to be really important is teammates knowing to pick AD champions inside a solo queue with Nasus or pick correct lane pairings with him. I think that it's unlikely that teammates are going to follow up on his timings with W and E, and if that's happening, it means that Nasus is not actually being picked for what makes him really strong, and it's no different than just playing a poke mage support at that point, because all you're going to be doing is spamming Spiritfire and Keck Wing every time that you W someone. If I am being fully honest, I think the only merit Nasus probably has inside of solo queue as a support is either at the highest ends of MMR or just solely in competitive play. But I do think that support is probably outright his best role because of his abilities to utilize these Season 12 abilities when you actually look at them, and the way that he's able to cheaply itemize into such absurd power. So again, recapping, if you look at the competitive match history marksmen that are very popular right now, you'll notice that Nasus actually hurts a lot of them that are extremely dependent on attack speed or just mobility in general. You look at a lot of the top laners, a lot of the junglers. Most of these are a lot of physical damage champions that also, again, are hurt by Wither. Another thing that you can notice is some of the marksmen that have begun popping up, like Xayah and Misfortune, are users of lethality. Varus even has been picked at several points, and these are all basically Nasus friends. A lot of the supports that are being picked in competitive right now are some of the tank supports, and Enchanters are here and there, but a lot of the tank supports aren't really that tanky when they're on top of the Nasus, and this makes for really easy 2 versus 2s. Anyways, that's it for the video. Hope that you guys did enjoy this. I know this is a kind of weird video in the sense that it's not actually directed at the mass majority of the player base, but I did want to make a video on it because I do feel like Nasus is a pick that could be seen in competitive. I know that it already has been picked. As I mentioned, I did end up tweeting about it earlier on a couple of weeks ago, but I feel like this champion could be seen a lot more. And there's really no excuse to not learn how to pick it up because you are playing with 2 abilities and they are very simple. Going? Okay. Remember, when you're playing a support Nasus, do not put points in queue. Yeah, that's it. We done?